Mike Henderson had been driving 18-wheelers for over 15 years when he encountered something on Interstate 80 that still keeps him awake at night. It was a cold February evening in 2018, and Mike was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Sacramento. The stretch of I-80 through Nebraska is notoriously desolate, especially during winter months when snow blankets the endless plains and visibility drops to almost nothing. Around 11 p.m., Mike was about 40 miles west of Grand Island when he first noticed the headlights in his rearview mirror. Two perfectly aligned beams cutting through the swirling snow, maintaining an exact distance behind his rig. At first, he didn't think much of it. Plenty of truckers ran the same routes, especially on major interstates. But as the miles rolled by, those headlights never wavered, never got closer, never fell back. Mike tried the CB radio to make contact. Breaker 19, this is Freight Dog eastbound on the 80 mile marker 285. You got your ears on back there? Nothing but static. He tried again, switching channels, but got no response. The headlights remained constant, like two unblinking eyes watching his every move. When Mike pulled into the Flying J truck stop in Big Springs around midnight, he expected to finally see who had been following him. He backed into a parking spot and climbed down from his cab, scanning the lot for the other truck. The parking area was nearly empty, just a few scattered rigs and a lone car near the fuel pumps. No truck had followed him in. Confused, Mike walked around the lot, checking behind other trailers and in the shadows near the building. Nothing. He went inside, grabbed a coffee, and asked the night clerk if he'd seen another big rig come in behind him. The clerk, a thin man with hollow eyes, just shook his head. You're the only truck that's come through here in the last hour, driver. Back on the road, Mike tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. Maybe he'd been imagining things. Long hauls could play tricks on your mind, especially in bad weather. But 20 minutes later, those same headlights appeared again in his mirrors, maintaining that exact same distance. This time, Mike decided to test something. He gradually reduced his speed from 65 to 55, then to 45 miles per hour. The headlights slowed with him, never closing the gap. When he accelerated back to highway speed, they matched his pace perfectly. It was as if the other driver was somehow synced to his movements, shadowing him with mechanical precision. The real terror began when Mike noticed something impossible. During a brief clearing in the snow, he caught a glimpse of the vehicle behind him in his side mirror. It was definitely a semi-truck, but something was wrong with the proportions. The cab seemed too tall, too narrow, like it had been stretched vertically, and the headlights. They weren't round like normal truck lights, but elongated, almost rectangular, giving off an unnatural blue-white glow. Mike's hands started shaking on the steering wheel. He'd seen every make and model of truck manufactured in the last 30 years, but this didn't match anything he knew. He grabbed his phone to take a picture, but when he held it up to the mirror, the screen showed nothing but darkness behind him. Yet when he looked directly in the mirror, the lights were still there. At the next rest area, Mike pulled off again, this time parking near other vehicles and waiting to see what would happen. He sat in his cab with the engine running, watching his mirrors. For 10 minutes, nothing. Then, just as he was about to pull back onto the highway, the headlights materialized again, sitting motionless at the rest area entrance as if they'd been waiting for him to make the first move. Mike decided he couldn't handle this alone. He called his dispatcher, then his wife, describing what was happening. Both told him he was probably just tired and should find a place to sleep for the night. But Mike knew this wasn't fatigue-induced paranoia. Something was actively stalking him across the Nebraska plains. He tried everything he could think of. He took random exits, doubling back on frontage roads, even pulling into a 24-hour Walmart parking lot and circling the building. Every time, without fail, those headlights would reappear exactly where they'd been before, maintaining that precise following distance, like a predator pacing its prey. The psychological torture continued for over 200 miles. Mike's CB radio started picking up strange transmissions. Not words, but a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to pulse in sync with his heartbeat. When he turned the radio off, he could still hear the humming, now seeming to come from inside his own cab. As dawn approached and Mike crossed into Colorado, exhaustion was taking its toll. His vision was blurring, and he was starting to question his own sanity. Then, somewhere near Sterling, the headlights began moving closer. For the first time in over 6 hours, the following distance was decreasing. Mike floored the accelerator, pushing his rig well beyond safe speeds for the icy conditions. In his mirror, he watched the headlights continue gaining ground with impossible smoothness, as if the pursuing vehicle wasn't bound by the same laws of physics that governed his own truck. Just as the mysterious lights seemed about to overtake him, Mike crested a hill and saw the welcome sight of a Colorado State Patrol station ahead. He pulled into the parking lot, horn blaring, and ran inside. The trooper on duty initially seemed skeptical of Mike's frantic story, but agreed to escort him back outside to check the area. The parking lot was empty except for Mike's truck and 2 patrol cars. No sign of the pursuing vehicle anywhere. The trooper ran Mike's information, checked his logbooks, and suggested he get some sleep before continuing his journey. Highway hypnosis, the officer said, happens to drivers more than you'd think, especially on long, empty stretches. Mike tried to accept this explanation, but he knew what he'd experienced was real. He spent the rest of the day at a truck stop in Denver, talking to other drivers about strange encounters on I-80. Several mentioned seeing unusual vehicles at night, describing headlights that didn't behave normally and trucks that seemed to appear and disappear without explanation. One veteran driver, a weathered man named Carl, who'd been running routes for over 20 years, pulled Mike aside. "You're not the first to see that thing," he said quietly. "Been reports going back decades. Some kind of phantom truck that follows drivers across Nebraska. Never heard of it doing anyone actual harm, but it sure as hell messes with your head." Carl explained that local truckers had developed their own theories about the phenomenon. Some believed it was the ghost of a driver who died in a blizzard decades ago, doomed to endlessly patrol the highway. Others thought it might be some kind of experimental military vehicle being tested on remote stretches of interstate. A few even suggested it could be connected to the area's history of cattle mutilations and other unexplained events. Mike completed his delivery to Sacramento without further incident, but the experience haunted him. He filed a report with his company and contacted several paranormal investigators who specialized in highway phenomena. None could provide a satisfactory explanation for what he'd encountered. In the months that followed, Mike continued driving, but avoided I-80 through Nebraska whenever possible. He joined online forums where truckers shared similar stories, finding dozens of accounts that matched his experience almost exactly. The details were always the same: the perfectly spaced headlights, the mechanical precision of the following behavior, the inability to make contact via CB radio, and the mysterious vehicle's ability to appear and disappear at will. What disturbed Mike most wasn't the supernatural aspects of the encounter, but the calculated, predatory nature of the stalking behavior. Whatever was behind those headlights seemed to take pleasure in psychological torment, following drivers for hours without revealing its intentions. The experience left him questioning not just what he'd seen, but whether the highways he'd traveled for years might harbor dangers far beyond the usual risks of weather mechanical failure, and human error. To this day, Mike carries extra batteries for his CB radio and keeps his phone fully charged whenever he drives at night. He's never seen those distinctive headlights again, but he knows other drivers have. The Phantom Trucker of Interstate 80 continues its endless patrol, waiting for the next lone driver to terrorize across the dark Nebraska plains. Danny Morse had been hauling freight across the Southwest for 12 years when he first encountered the rest stop that shouldn't exist. It was late October 2019, and he was running a load of auto parts from Phoenix to Dallas along Interstate 20. The Texas stretch between Fort Stockton and Odessa is notorious among truckers. Over 200 miles of barren desert with minimal services and cell towers, few and far between. Around 2 a.m., Danny's bladder was screaming for relief, and his fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty. He'd miscalculated his fuel stops, a rookie mistake that could leave him stranded in the middle of nowhere. The GPS showed no services for another 87 miles, but then he saw it, a blue highway sign reflecting in his headlights. Rest area 2 miles. Danny couldn't remember any rest area along this stretch from his previous runs, but fatigue could play tricks on memory. As he crested a small hill, he spotted the familiar layout ahead, a rectangular building with restrooms, a few picnic tables, and adequate parking for several big rigs. Most importantly, he could make out the distinctive pumps of a fuel station attached to the main structure. The rest area was unusually well maintained for such a remote location. The parking lot was freshly paved, the building looked newly constructed, and bright fluorescent lights illuminated the entire facility. Danny backed his rig into a parking spot and climbed down, grateful for the chance to stretch his legs and fill his tank. The fuel pumps were older models, the kind you'd see at independent truck stops in rural areas, but they worked fine. As Danny filled his tank, he noticed something odd. There was no price display on the pump, and no payment terminal. When he finished fueling, he walked toward the building to pay, assuming there must be an attendant inside. The restroom building was spotless, almost sterile in its cleanliness. The floors gleamed under harsh fluorescent lighting, and everything smelled strongly of industrial disinfectant. But it was the silence that unnerved him most. No humming of ventilation systems, no distant highway noise, no sound at all, except his own footsteps echoing off the tile walls. Danny used the facilities and then looked for someone to pay for his fuel. There was no attendant booth, no cashier window, nothing that indicated how payment was supposed to work. He walked around the building twice, checking for any signs or contact information. The only marking he found was a small metal plaque near the entrance that read, Texas Department of Transportation, Est, 1987, open 24 hours. Confused but not wanting to be accused of stealing fuel, Danny left a $20 bill weighted down with a rock near the fuel pumps. He climbed back into his cab and continued east, putting the strange encounter out of his mind. He had a delivery schedule to maintain, and dwelling on minor oddities was a luxury he couldn't afford. 3 weeks later, Danny was running the same route when his fuel situation became critical again in almost exactly the same spot. This time, he was specifically looking for the rest area, remembering it as a convenient fuel stop. But as he approached the location where he was certain it had been, there was nothing. Just endless desert scrubland on both sides of the highway. Danny pulled over and checked his GPS, his logbook, even looked up the area on his phone's map app. No rest area was marked anywhere in that vicinity. The closest services were exactly where he remembered them being before, over 80 miles away. Confused and increasingly anxious about his fuel situation, he had no choice but to nurse his rig to the next truck stop, barely making it on fumes. At the Flying J in Odessa, Danny asked other drivers about rest areas along that stretch of I-20. Several veteran drivers who'd been running Texas routes for decades all gave him the same answer. There were no rest areas between Fort Stockton and Odessa, never had been. "You might be thinking of the old Texaco station that used to be out there," suggested one driver. "But that's been closed for 15 years, maybe more. State condemned the property after some kind of accident." That night in his sleeper berth, Danny couldn't shake the memory of that rest area. Every detail was crystal clear: the layout, the fuel pumps, the sterile restroom building. He'd even left money for the fuel he'd pumped. It had been absolutely real, not some fatigue-induced hallucination. Unable to sleep, Danny started researching online. He found several truckers' forums where drivers shared stories about mysterious stops along various highways. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Multiple drivers reported encountering the same rest area he'd described, always in different locations, but always with identical features: the sterile building, the old-style fuel pumps with no payment system, and the complete silence. The most disturbing posts came from drivers who'd stopped there multiple times. They described a growing sense of unease with each visit, as if something was subtly wrong, but impossible to pinpoint. Some mentioned finding personal items in the restrooms that didn't belong to them, items that seemed to be from different time periods. One driver claimed to have found a trucker's logbook from 1987 sitting on a sink counter, filled out in handwriting that wasn't his own. Danny found a forum thread from 2003 where a driver named Pete Richardson described an experience nearly identical to his own. Pete had stopped at the mysterious rest area 3 times over the course of 6 months, each time in a different state, but always along desolate stretches of interstate. On his 4th encounter, Pete wrote, he'd decided to stay longer and explore the facility more thoroughly. According to Pete's posts, he'd discovered that the building was much larger inside than it appeared from the outside. Beyond the main restroom area were additional corridors lined with what looked like motel room doors. When he tried the handles, all were locked except one at the far end of the hallway. Inside, he found a small room furnished with a bed, a desk, and personal belongings that looked decades old: clothes, toiletries, and photographs of people in outdated styles. Pete's final post in the thread was brief and disturbing. "Found more rooms, some occupied. Getting out of here. Don't stop at the clean rest area. Just don't." Danny tried to contact Pete through the forum's messaging system, but the account had been inactive for over 15 years. He searched for Pete Richardson in trucking industry databases and missing persons reports, but found no trace of anyone by that name. As weeks passed, Danny found himself obsessively planning routes that would take him back to that stretch of I-20. He told himself it was just curiosity, but deep down, he knew he was being drawn back to something he didn't understand. The logical part of his mind insisted the whole thing had been a stress-induced hallucination, but the memory remained stubbornly vivid. 2 months after his initial encounter, Danny was deadheading back to Phoenix when he made a deliberate detour to drive that specific section of highway. It was the same time of night, and he'd even let his fuel run low to recreate the original circumstances. As he approached the area where the rest stop had appeared, his hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The rest area was there again, exactly as he remembered it. The same bright lights, the same pristine building, the same eerie silence. This time, Danny parked but didn't get out immediately. He sat in his cab, engine idling, studying the facility through his windshield. Everything looked identical to his first visit, down to the placement of the picnic tables and the style of the light fixtures. Against his better judgment, Danny climbed down from his cab. The silence was even more oppressive this time, as if the entire area existed in a vacuum separate from the rest of the world. He walked slowly toward the building, his footsteps seeming unnaturally loud on the asphalt. The restroom was exactly as he remembered, spotlessly clean and sterile. But this time, Danny noticed details he'd missed before. The fluorescent lights didn't flicker like normal fixtures, and they cast no shadows, despite their brightness. The mirrors above the sinks reflected his image, but something seemed off about the reflection, as if he was looking at himself from a slightly different angle than he was actually standing. Driven by a morbid curiosity he couldn't explain, Danny decided to explore beyond the main restroom area. He found a door he hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind a maintenance panel. The door was unlocked and opened onto a long, narrow corridor lined with numbered doors, just as Pete Richardson had described. The hallway stretched much farther than should have been possible given the building's exterior dimensions. Danny walked slowly down the corridor, trying door handles as he went. Most were locked, but from behind some of them, he could hear faint sounds, rustling, muffled voices, and what might have been crying. At door number 23, Danny heard something that made his heart stop, the unmistakable sound of a diesel engine idling. He pressed his ear to the door and could clearly hear the rhythmic rumble of a big rig's engine, along with what sounded like a CB radio, crackling with distant voices. When he tried the handle, the door was locked, but through the keyhole, he could see flickering light as if from a television or computer screen. Danny backed away from the door, his mind reeling. How could there be a truck engine running inside a building? The sound was too clear, too distinct to be coming from outside. As he stood in the hallway, paralyzed by confusion and growing terror, he noticed that the sounds from other rooms were becoming clearer too. From door 19, he could hear what sounded like a man talking on a phone, discussing delivery schedules and route planning. From door 31, the unmistakable sound of someone snoring. The horrible realization crept over Danny that these weren't empty rooms. They were occupied. But by what, or by whom, he couldn't fathom. The building was impossible, existing in a space that shouldn't contain it, filled with sounds that defied logical explanation. Danny ran back down the corridor, through the main restroom area, and out to his truck. His hands were shaking so badly, he could barely start the engine. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he looked back in his mirrors to see the rest area fading into darkness behind him, as if the lights were being systematically turned off room by room. He never drove that route again. Danny transferred to regional runs that kept him close to major cities, and eventually left long-haul trucking altogether. But sometimes, late at night when he can't sleep, he finds himself searching online for other drivers who might have encountered the rest area that appears and disappears along America's loneliest highways. The most disturbing thing isn't that the place exists, Danny realized. It's the growing suspicion that some of the drivers who stop there never leave, that they become permanent residents of those impossible rooms, their voices joining the chorus of sounds that echo through corridors that shouldn't exist, waiting for the next unsuspecting trucker to discover that some rest stops never really close. Ray Kowalski had one strict rule during his 23 years of long-haul trucking: never pick up hitchhikers. He'd seen too many drivers get robbed, assaulted, or worse, by strangers they'd let into their cabs out of misplaced sympathy. But on a rain-soaked night in March 2017, driving through the mountains of West Virginia on Route 119, Ray broke his own rule for the first and last time. The storm had been building all evening as Ray hauled a load of furniture from North Carolina to Pittsburgh. By 11 p.m., the rain was coming down in sheets, and visibility was so poor he could barely see the yellow lines. The winding mountain road was treacherous in good weather, and the combination of rain, fog, and steep grades made every mile a white-knuckle experience. That's when Ray saw her in his headlights. A young woman standing on the shoulder, completely soaked, waving desperately for help. She appeared to be in her early 20s, wearing jeans and a light jacket that offered no protection against the downpour. What made Ray slow down wasn't just her obvious distress, but the fact that she was at least 50 miles from the nearest town, standing in one of the most remote and dangerous stretches of Appalachian Highway. Ray pulled over and rolled down his passenger window. The woman approached the cab, her long dark hair plastered to her face, water streaming from her clothes. "Please," she called up to him, her voice barely audible over the storm. "My car broke down about 2 miles back. I've been walking for hours. I just need to get to the next town." Against every instinct screaming at him to drive away, Ray found himself unlocking the passenger door. The woman climbed up into the cab, bringing with her the smell of rain and something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminded Ray of flowers left too long in a vase. She settled into the passenger seat without a word, pulling the door shut behind her. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice soft and strangely melodic. "I didn't think anyone would stop." When Ray looked over at her, he was struck by how pale her skin was, almost translucent in the cab's dim lighting. Her eyes were dark, so dark he couldn't make out the pupils, and when she smiled, her teeth seemed unnaturally white. "No problem," Ray replied, though he was already regretting his decision. "What's your name?" "I'm Ray." "Sarah," she answered, but something about the way she said it made Ray think she'd hesitated, as if she'd had to remember the name. "I'm Sarah." Ray put the truck back in gear and continued up the mountain road. Sarah sat silently beside him, staring straight ahead through the windshield. She didn't shiver despite being soaked to the skin, and Ray noticed that the cab's temperature seemed to have dropped several degrees since she'd gotten in. He turned up the heat, but the chill remained. As they drove, Ray tried to make conversation, but Sarah's responses were minimal and strange. When he asked where she was from, she said, "Around here," but couldn't name a specific town. When he mentioned her car breaking down, she seemed confused for a moment, before nodding vaguely. Most unsettling was the way she stared at him when she thought he wasn't looking, not with gratitude or normal human curiosity, but with an intensity that made his skin crawl. After about 30 minutes, Ray noticed something that made his blood run cold. Despite the heavy rain and humid conditions, the windows around Sarah weren't fogging up from her breath. In fact, he couldn't see any condensation from her breathing at all. When he glanced over at her chest, he realized with growing horror that he couldn't detect any movement, no rise and fall that would indicate breathing. Ray's hands tightened on the steering wheel as panic began to set in. He tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Maybe she was just breathing very shallowly, or maybe the strange lighting in the cab was playing tricks on his eyes. But deep down, he knew something was fundamentally wrong with his passenger. "So Sarah," Ray said, forcing his voice to remain steady, "what do you do for work?" Sarah turned to look at him with those impossibly dark eyes. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat. "I wait," she said simply. "I wait for people like you." The temperature in the cab plummeted further, and Ray could now see his own breath misting in the air. Ice began forming on the inside corners of the windshield, despite the heater running at full blast. Sarah's wet clothes should have been steaming in the warm cab, but instead, they seemed to be drying without producing any visible vapor. Ray knew he had to get this woman, or whatever she was, out of his truck. The next town was still 20 miles away, but he remembered passing a 24-hour gas station about 5 miles back down the mountain. He would turn around, take her there, and let someone else deal with whatever was happening. "You know what?" Ray said, trying to keep his tone casual. "I just remembered I need to fuel up. There's a station back down the road. I'll drop you there, and I'm sure someone can help you get to town." Sarah's head turned toward him with an unnatural, fluid motion, like an owl rotating its neck. "No," she said, and her voice had changed completely. It was deeper now, multiplied, as if several people were speaking in unison. "We're not going back." Ray's foot involuntarily pressed harder on the accelerator. He wanted to get to the next town as quickly as possible, to bright lights and other people. But as his speed increased, Sarah placed one hand on the dashboard, and Ray felt the truck beginning to slow down, despite his foot on the gas pedal. The engine continued running, but it was as if some invisible force was holding the vehicle back. "What are you?" Ray whispered, no longer able to maintain the pretense that this was a normal situation. Sarah smiled, and this time, Ray could see that her teeth were not white, but completely black, like she had a mouth full of coal. "I'm what happens," she said in that multiplied voice, "when people don't listen to their instincts." The truck had now slowed to a crawl, despite Ray's desperate attempts to accelerate. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he could see that the road ahead seemed to be stretching, as if the distance to the next town was somehow growing longer with each passing moment. The familiar landmarks he'd passed on this route dozens of times were nowhere to be seen. Ray grabbed his CB radio, frantically switching channels and calling for help. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Freight Dog on Route 119, mile marker. Mile marker." He looked at the mile markers they were passing, but the numbers made no sense. Some were repeating, others were counting backward, and some displayed symbols he didn't recognize. Static filled the radio, but underneath the white noise, Ray could hear something that made his heart nearly stop. Voices, dozens of them, all crying out in terror and desperation. They were the voices of other drivers, other people who had made the same mistake he had, calling for help that would never come. Sarah was no longer looking at Ray. Instead, she was staring out the passenger window at something in the darkness beyond the tree line. Ray followed her gaze and saw lights moving through the forest. Not flashlights or vehicle headlights, but pale, cold illumination that seemed to dance between the trees like will-o'-the-wisps. "They're waiting," Sarah said, her voice now barely human. "They've been waiting so long." Ray realized with growing horror that he was no longer in control of his truck. The steering wheel turned under his hands, guiding the big rig toward a dirt road he'd never seen before, despite having driven this route countless times. The headlights illuminated a narrow path that wound deeper into the mountains, flanked by trees so tall and dense they blocked out what little light came from the stormy sky. As they drove deeper into the forest, Ray began to see other vehicles along the path, trucks, cars, motorcycles, all in various states of decay. Some looked like they'd been there for decades, their metal frames rusted and covered in moss and vines. Others appeared more recent, but all were empty, their doors hanging open as if their occupants had simply vanished. The dirt road ended in a clearing, where dozens of vehicles formed a rough circle around what looked like an old mining operation. Rusted equipment and abandoned buildings created a maze of shadows and twisted metal. And standing among the wreckage were figures, people who had once been drivers like Ray, but who now stood motionless and silent, their eyes reflecting the pale light that emanated from somewhere deeper in the mine. Ray's truck came to a stop without him touching the brakes. Sarah turned to look at him one final time, and he saw that her face was changing, becoming less human with each passing second. Her features were melting and reforming, as if her appearance had never been fixed to begin with. "Thank you for the ride," she said in a voice that was now completely inhuman. a sound like wind through empty caves. "You can get out now." Ray wanted to refuse, wanted to start the engine and drive away, but his hands moved without his conscious control. He opened the driver's door and climbed down from the cab, his legs carrying him forward, even as his mind screamed in protest. The other figures in the clearing turned to watch him approach, their faces blank and their movements unnaturally synchronized. As Ray walked toward the mine entrance, he could hear his truck's engine starting up behind him. When he turned back, Sarah was now in the driver's seat, adjusting the mirrors with practiced ease. She gave him a little wave before putting the truck in gear and driving back toward the main road, no doubt to wait for the next trucker, who would be foolish enough to pick up a hitchhiker on a dark and stormy night. Ray tried to scream, tried to run, but his body no longer belonged to him. He joined the circle of silent figures, taking his place among the dozens of other drivers who had broken their own rules and paid the ultimate price. And there he stands still, waiting in the clearing, watching for new arrivals, while Sarah continues her eternal hunt along the mountain roads of West Virginia. The strange thing is that Ray's truck was found 3 days later, abandoned at a rest stop outside Charleston. The load was intact, the keys were still in the ignition, and there was no sign of what had happened to the driver. The official report listed it as a voluntary abandonment, just another trucker who had walked away from his responsibilities without explanation. But other drivers who run Route 119 know better. They've seen the young woman standing by the roadside during storms, looking desperately for a ride. And they've learned to keep their doors locked and their eyes on the road, no matter how much she might wave or cry for help. Because some hitchhikers are looking for more than just transportation, and some rides end in places that don't appear on any map. Tom Bradley was running a routine load of construction equipment from Kansas City to Denver when he encountered the wait station that forever changed his understanding of what government facilities actually measure. It was mid-September 2020, and Tom had been driving commercially for 8 years without a single violation or citation. He prided himself on maintaining his equipment perfectly and keeping his loads within legal weight limits. The incident occurred on Interstate 70 through eastern Colorado, a stretch of highway Tom knew well. Around 3 a.m., driving through the pre-dawn darkness, he saw the familiar blue signs indicating a mandatory weigh station ahead. This particular station wasn't one he remembered from previous runs, but new facilities were occasionally built, and the signage was official enough: clean, reflective, and properly positioned according to DOT standards. Tom pulled into the weigh station following the clearly marked truck lane. The facility looked modern and well-maintained, with multiple scales and a central office building that was brightly lit despite the early hour. What struck him as unusual was the complete absence of other trucks. Most mandatory stations had at least some traffic, even in the middle of the night, but this place was eerily deserted. The electronic signs directed Tom to scale number 3. As he positioned his rig on the platform, he noticed that the scale itself seemed different from others he'd used. Instead of the typical concrete and steel construction, this platform had a strange, almost organic texture, with surfaces that seemed to pulse subtly under his truck's weight. The sensation was so faint that Tom initially attributed it to fatigue playing tricks on his perception. The weigh process should have taken less than a minute, but the digital display kept cycling through numbers that made no sense. Instead of showing his truck's actual weight of approximately 78,000 pounds, the readout displayed figures like 156,847 pounds, then 203,192 pounds, then dropped to 12,003 pounds, before jumping to over 400,000 pounds. Tom had never seen a scale malfunction so dramatically. A voice crackled over the intercom system. "Driver, please report to the office for inspection." The voice was distorted by static, but something about its tone made Tom's skin crawl. It sounded too formal, too precise, as if whoever was speaking was carefully pronouncing each word according to a script they'd memorized but didn't quite understand. Tom climbed down from his cab and walked toward the office building. The closer he got, the more details he noticed that didn't quite add up. The building's architecture was standard government issue, but the windows were tinted so darkly he couldn't see inside, and there were no visible agency logos or identification numbers that should have been prominently displayed. Inside, the office was harshly lit by fluorescent lights that buzzed with an electrical hum louder than normal. Behind a counter sat a man in what appeared to be a DOT uniform, but the uniform was wrong somehow. The colors were slightly off, the patches were positioned incorrectly, and the fabric had an unnatural sheen to it. The man himself looked normal at first glance, but when Tom looked directly at him, he noticed the official's skin had a waxy, artificial appearance, like a department store mannequin. "License and registration, please," the official said in that same overly precise voice Tom had heard on the intercom. When Tom handed over his documents, the man's movements were mechanical and stiff, as if he was operating his own body through conscious effort rather than natural reflexes. The official examined Tom's paperwork with unusual intensity, holding each document unnaturally close to his face. His eyes didn't move back and forth like someone reading. Instead, they remained fixed in one position while he held the papers at different angles, as if he was scanning them with some kind of internal sensor rather than actually reading the text. "Your load appears to be overweight," the official finally announced, though Tom knew this was impossible. He'd weighed the trailer at the origin point and had been well within legal limits. "We'll need to conduct a more thorough inspection." The official led Tom to a bay area behind the main building, where his truck had somehow been moved without him hearing the engine start or seeing anyone drive it. This was Tom's first moment of real alarm. He always kept his keys with him, and the truck had been locked. When he mentioned this to the official, the man simply stared at him with those unblinking eyes and repeated, "We'll need to conduct a more thorough inspection." The inspection area was unlike any Tom had seen at other way stations. Instead of the typical concrete floor and basic tools, this bay contained elaborate machinery that hummed and whirred with electronic sounds. Cables and sensors were attached to various points on his trailer, and monitors displayed readings that consisted of symbols and numbers Tom didn't recognize. What happened next defied all logic. The official directed Tom to stand on a small platform beside his truck. "For calibration purposes," he explained. The moment Tom stepped onto the platform, every screen in the facility began displaying rapidly changing numbers. But these weren't weight measurements. The readouts included what appeared to be biological data: heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, and other metrics that no truck weigh station had any reason to monitor. Tom tried to step off the platform, but found that his feet seemed to be stuck to its surface, not physically attached, but held by some kind of magnetic or electrical force that prevented him from lifting his legs. Panic began to set in as he realized he couldn't move from the platform, and the official was watching him with an expression that was no longer attempting to appear human. The readings on the monitors became more disturbing. Tom could see displays tracking what appeared to be his emotional state, stress levels, and something labeled cognitive resonance that fluctuated as his fear increased. Other screens showed anatomical diagrams that rotated and zoomed in on different parts of his body, highlighting organs and systems in ways that suggested a medical examination far more detailed than any external scan could provide. "Excellent readings," the official commented, but his voice had changed. The carefully modulated tone was gone, replaced by something that sounded like multiple voices speaking simultaneously, as if several people were trying to use the same vocal cords. This specimen shows optimal parameters for processing. Tom's terror peaked when he realized that other figures had entered the inspection bay, more officials in the same wrong uniforms, all moving with the same mechanical precision. They surrounded his truck and began connecting additional equipment that definitely wasn't standard DOT inspection gear. The devices looked more like medical equipment or laboratory instruments, with tubes, needles, and collection chambers that made no sense in the context of a truck inspection. One of the figures approached Tom with what appeared to be a large syringe. "This will just take a moment," it said in that multi-layered voice. "We need samples for proper cataloging." Tom found his voice and began screaming for help, but his cries seemed to be absorbed by the building itself, producing no echo or reverberation. The officials paid no attention to his distress, continuing their preparations with mechanical efficiency. Tom could see his reflection in the bay's polished surfaces, but what terrified him most was that the officials cast no reflections at all. The mirrors and chrome surfaces showed only Tom and his truck, as if the uniformed figures weren't physically present. The needle was inches from Tom's arm when suddenly all the equipment shut down simultaneously. The lights went out, the humming stopped, and Tom found he could move his feet again. In the darkness, he heard the officials speaking to each other in voices that were no longer attempting to sound human, a rapid, chittering communication that resembled insect sounds more than speech. Emergency lighting flickered on, bathing everything in a red glow. Tom ran toward his truck, expecting to find it disabled or damaged, but the engine started immediately. He didn't wait to understand what had happened or why he'd been released. He drove out of the inspection bay and back onto the highway as fast as he could manage, not stopping until he reached a familiar truck stop 30 miles down the road. At the truck stop, Tom immediately called the Colorado Department of Transportation to report the incident. The dispatcher he spoke with was confused by his description of the facility's location. According to official records, there was no mandatory weigh station at the mile marker Tom specified. The nearest inspection facility was over 100 miles away, and it hadn't been operational for mandatory inspections in over 2 years due to budget cuts. Tom insisted he had the location right and even provided the exact mile marker where he'd exited the highway. The DOT dispatcher ran a thorough check of all facilities along that stretch of I-70 and confirmed that no weigh station, mandatory or otherwise, existed at that location. The state had never operated an inspection facility there, and no permits had been issued for any private company to construct such a facility. Disturbed by the discrepancy, Tom drove back to the location the next day with another driver as a witness. They found nothing but empty prairie land on both sides of the highway. No buildings, no scales, no access roads. Just the natural Colorado landscape that had been there for thousands of years. Even more unsettling, there were no signs that any construction had ever taken place at that location. No concrete foundations, no electrical connections, no disturbance of the soil that would indicate recent building activity. Tom reported the incident to the state police, who conducted their own investigation. Officers found no evidence of any structures at the specified location, no reports of similar incidents from other drivers, and no explanation for what Tom claimed to have experienced. The official report classified the incident as driver fatigue hallucination, a relatively common occurrence among long-haul truckers. But Tom knew what he had experienced was real. The proof was in his logbook, where the electronic monitoring system had recorded a 2-hour gap in his driving time at the exact location he'd described. The truck's GPS system also showed a stationary period at that mile marker, even though there was supposedly nothing there for him to have stopped at. More disturbing were the medical tests Tom underwent at his own expense a week after the incident. Blood work revealed unusual chemical compounds that his doctor couldn't identify, and MRI scans showed microscopic metallic objects in his bloodstream that hadn't been there during his last DOT physical 6 months earlier. When Tom tried to have the metallic objects analyzed, they mysteriously disappeared from the lab samples before testing could be completed. Tom continued driving for several more months, but he avoided that stretch of I-70 whenever possible. Other drivers he spoke with mentioned unusual experiences at what they thought were legitimate way stations, facilities that appeared on no official maps, inspections that involved equipment not related to trucking, and officials whose behavior seemed somehow inhuman. The most chilling discovery came when Tom joined an online forum for commercial drivers and found dozens of similar accounts. Drivers across the country reported encounters with mysterious inspection facilities that appeared and disappeared, officials who didn't seem entirely human, and medical symptoms that appeared after visits to these non-existent stations. Tom eventually left long-haul trucking and took a local delivery job that kept him within 50 miles of his home base. He never found a satisfactory explanation for what happened at the weight station that wasn't supposed to exist, but he learned that some government facilities measure more than just the weight of your cargo. They measure things about the drivers themselves that no legitimate agency has any business collecting. The most disturbing realization is that these encounters are still happening. Somewhere on America's highways, disguised as routine regulatory stops, facilities continue to appear that serve purposes far removed from transportation safety, and the drivers who encounter them are left with more questions than answers, and sometimes with changes to their own bodies that they never consented to and can't explain. Marcus Rivera had been hauling freight across the Midwest for 15 years when he joined the convoy that changed his understanding of what happens to truckers who disappear without a trace. It was late November 2019, and Marcus was deadheading from Detroit to Oklahoma City with an empty trailer when he encountered what initially seemed like the camaraderie that makes long-haul trucking bearable during the loneliest hours. The encounter began around 2 a.m. on Interstate 65 through Indiana. Marcus was fighting fatigue and considering pulling over for a few hours of sleep when he spotted headlights approaching fast in his mirrors. As the vehicle drew closer, he could see it was another big rig, followed by 2 more trucks, maintaining perfect formation. The lead truck pulled alongside Marcus, and the driver gestured for him to roll down his window. "Convoy forming up for the southern run," the other driver called across the gap between their cabs. He appeared to be in his 50s, wearing a baseball cap and flannel shirt, typical of veteran drivers. "Got room for 1 more if you're heading toward Oklahoma. Safer to run together through the construction zones." Marcus knew the stretch of highway ahead had several active construction areas with narrow lanes and reduced speed limits. Running in a convoy would indeed be safer, and the company of other drivers would help him stay alert. He gave a thumbs up and fell into formation as the 4th truck in the line. The lead driver introduced himself over the CB as Iron Horse, followed by Mudflap and Diesel Dan. Marcus used his handle, Desert Fox, and settled into the convoy's rhythm. The formation was impressively tight and professional. Each truck maintained perfect spacing, and lane changes were executed with military precision. These were clearly experienced drivers who had worked together before. As they rolled through the Indiana countryside, the CB chatter was typical trucker conversation. Weather conditions, road reports, and good-natured ribbing between the drivers. But as the hours passed, Marcus began noticing subtle oddities in their communication. The other drivers spoke in perfect unison when acknowledging road conditions. Their responses were identical down to the specific phrases they used, and none of them seemed to have distinct personalities, despite using different handles. Around 4 a.m., Marcus realized they'd been driving for over 2 hours without any of the other trucks stopping for fuel, bathroom breaks, or the mandatory rest periods required by federal regulations. When he mentioned needing to stop at the next truck stop, the response from Iron Horse was immediate and synchronized with the others. Negative, Desert Fox. We maintain formation until destination. Marcus tried to explain that he was legally required to take breaks according to his logbook, but the other drivers simply repeated the same phrase in unison. More disturbing was the fact that their voices were becoming increasingly similar over the radio, as if the 3 distinct personalities he'd heard earlier were merging into a single entity, speaking with multiple mouths. The first sign of real trouble came when Marcus attempted to exit the convoy at a truck stop near Indianapolis. As he signaled his intention to pull off at the next ramp, he found his steering wheel becoming increasingly difficult to turn. It wasn't a mechanical problem with his truck. The power steering was working fine for normal driving, but whenever he tried to steer away from the convoy formation, the wheel would resist, as if some invisible force was keeping him aligned with the other vehicles. Marcus tried reducing his speed to fall behind the convoy, but his accelerator pedal became unresponsive. The truck maintained its exact speed and position, regardless of his inputs. When he attempted to use his Jake brake to slow down, nothing happened. The truck continued rolling forward at precisely the same speed as the others, maintaining that perfect formation spacing, as if all 4 vehicles were connected by invisible cables. Panic set in when Marcus realized he was no longer in control of his own truck. He tried the CB radio again, this time calling for emergency assistance on Channel 19. Mayday, Mayday. This is Desert Fox on I-65 northbound, mile marker 127. I've lost control of my vehicle and need immediate assistance. The response came not from emergency services or other drivers, but from the 3 trucks in his convoy, speaking in perfect unison. Desert Fox, you are exactly where you need to be. Maintain formation. Destination approaching. Marcus grabbed his cell phone to call 911, but the screen showed no signal despite being in an area with normally excellent coverage. When he tried his truck's satellite communication system, it displayed an error message he'd never seen before. Communication restricted during convoy operations. As dawn approached, Marcus noticed they were no longer following the route he'd expected. Instead of continuing toward Oklahoma, the convoy had somehow shifted onto roads that didn't appear on his GPS. The landscape outside looked wrong, too flat, too empty, with vegetation that seemed withered and unnatural. The few buildings they passed appeared abandoned, their windows dark and their parking lots empty of any vehicles, except for the occasional big rig sitting motionless and apparently deserted. The most terrifying realization came when Marcus looked closely at the other trucks in his convoy. What he'd initially taken for normal road wear and weather damage was actually something far more disturbing. The trailers had rust patterns that looked almost organic, spreading across the metal surfaces like veins or root systems. The paint on the cabs was faded in ways that suggested decades of exposure to elements. Yet the trucks moved with perfect mechanical precision. Around noon, though Marcus's watch had stopped working hours earlier, the convoy pulled into what appeared to be a massive truck stop. But this facility was unlike any Marcus had ever seen. The parking lot stretched for miles in every direction, filled with hundreds of big rigs arranged in perfect rows. None of the trucks showed any signs of recent activity. No drivers walking around, no engines running, no lights in any of the sleeper cabs. The building at the center of this vast parking area was enormous, easily the size of several aircraft hangars. Its architecture was wrong somehow, with angles that seemed to bend in directions that hurt to look at directly. The structure appeared to be constructed from the same materials as truck trailers, but weathered and corroded until it took on an almost biological appearance. Marcus's truck came to a stop in a designated parking space, the engine shutting off automatically, despite the key still being in his possession. The doors unlocked with a mechanical click that echoed strangely in the sudden silence. Outside, the other drivers from his convoy were climbing down from their cabs, moving with the same synchronized precision they'd maintained on the road. "Welcome to your destination," Iron Horse said, but his voice now came from all three drivers simultaneously. When Marcus looked at them closely, he saw that their faces had become identical, as if they were three copies of the same person, rather than distinct individuals. Their skin had the same weathered, corroded appearance as their trucks, and their eyes reflected light, like reflective road signs, rather than human pupils. Marcus tried to start his truck and leave, but the engine wouldn't respond. He attempted to use his radio to call for help, but every channel produced the same result. That synchronized voice telling him he was exactly where he needed to be. When he looked around the massive parking lot, he could see other drivers near some of the trucks, all standing motionless beside their vehicles, like sentries waiting for orders that would never come. The horrible truth became clear when Marcus noticed his own reflection in his truck's mirror. His face was beginning to change, taking on the same weathered appearance as the other drivers. His clothes were fading to match the same generic trucker uniform worn by everyone else in the facility. Most disturbing of all, when he tried to speak, his voice was starting to synchronize with the others, losing its individual characteristics and blending into the collective sound that echoed across the endless parking lot. Marcus realized he was becoming part of the convoy, losing his individual identity and joining the collective of drivers who had been recruited one by one from highways across the country. His memories of life before the convoy were already becoming fuzzy, replaced by an overwhelming compulsion to return to the roads and find other drivers to recruit into their endless formation. The last coherent thought Marcus had as an individual was the understanding that this was what happened to the truckers who disappeared, the ones whose abandoned rigs were found at rest stops with no trace of their drivers, the ones whose families never got answers about where they'd gone. They hadn't been victims of foul play or voluntary abandonment. They'd been recruited into a convoy that traveled roads that didn't exist on any map, gathering more drivers to join their synchronized formation until they had enough members to establish new recruiting posts. Marcus took his place among the identical figures standing beside their trucks, waiting for the next phase of operations. Soon, the convoy would split up and return to the regular highways, each driver searching for lonely truckers who might be convinced to join their formation. The cycle would continue, expanding their numbers one recruit at a time, until every truck on America's highways was part of their coordinated network. The facility exists beyond normal geography, accessible only through specific routes that appear when the convoy needs new members. The trucks parked there represent decades of recruitment, each one operated by a driver who once had a name, a family, and an individual identity. Now they serve a collective purpose that transcends human understanding, maintaining perfect formation as they travel between the world of normal trucking and the realm where all convoys eventually converge. Sometimes, other drivers report seeing impossibly long convoys on remote stretches of highway, formations of trucks that seem to stretch beyond the horizon, all maintaining perfect spacing and moving with synchronized precision. These observers assume they're witnessing some kind of military or commercial operation, never realizing they're looking at the recruitment wing of something far more sinister. The convoy continues its work, patrolling America's highways in smaller formations, always ready to offer the camaraderie and safety that solitary drivers crave during their loneliest hours. And in truck stops across the country, families continue to wait for drivers who will never come home, their loved ones having joined a convoy that never stops rolling, never reaches its final destination, and never releases the drivers who become part of its eternal formation. Jake Morrison had hauled everything from furniture to livestock during his 11 years as an owner-operator. But the load he picked up in Portland on a foggy October morning in 2021 would be his last. The dispatch had come through his broker at 3 a.m., an urgent delivery from Oregon to a small town in Montana, with a premium rate that was too good to refuse. The cargo was listed as medical supplies with special handling instructions, and the shipper was willing to pay double the standard rate for immediate transport. Jake arrived at the pickup location just after dawn. The facility was in an industrial area he'd never worked before, housed in a nondescript warehouse with no company signage or identification. The loading dock was supervised by two men in coveralls who spoke very little English and seemed nervous about something. They directed Jake to back up to Bay 7, where his trailer would be loaded by their personnel. The loading process took much longer than normal for what should have been a straightforward pickup. Jake waited in his cab for over 3 hours while the warehouse crew loaded his trailer, and during that time, he noticed several odd details. The workers wore full hazmat suits, despite the cargo supposedly being routine medical supplies, and they used equipment more suited for handling hazardous materials than standard freight. When the loading was finally complete, the warehouse foreman handed Jake a sealed envelope containing the delivery paperwork. "Don't open this until you reach the destination," the man instructed in heavily accented English. "Very important you follow route exactly as written. No stops except for fuel. No looking in trailer." Jake signed the bills of lading without examining them closely, a mistake he would regret for the rest of his shortened life. The paperwork showed a delivery address in a town called Millfield, Montana, with GPS coordinates that placed it somewhere in the remote northern part of the state. The cargo was described only as biological research materials, with handling codes Jake didn't recognize. The first sign that something was wrong came about 50 miles outside Portland. Jake began smelling something through his cab's ventilation system, a sweet, cloying odor that reminded him of flowers mixed with something medicinal. He initially assumed it was just roadside vegetation, or perhaps a chemical plant he was passing, but the smell persisted and gradually grew stronger. By the time Jake reached the Idaho border, the odor had become nauseating. He tried closing his vents and switching to recirculated air, but the smell seemed to be coming from inside his own truck. Worse, he was beginning to hear sounds from his trailer, not the normal shifting and settling of cargo, but rhythmic tapping and scratching that suggested something alive was moving around back there. Jake pulled into a truck stop near Coeur d'Alene, intending to inspect his trailer, despite the shipper's instructions. But when he walked to the back of his rig, he found that the trailer doors had been sealed with some kind of industrial adhesive that had hardened into an impenetrable barrier. The entire rear of the trailer was coated in a substance that looked like hardened resin, making it impossible to open the doors without specialized equipment. More disturbing was what Jake observed about the trailer itself. The aluminum sides were beginning to show dark stains that seemed to be spreading from the inside out, as if something in the cargo was leaking through the metal walls. The stains had an organic appearance, like blood stains or some other bodily fluid, and they pulsed with a subtle rhythm that reminded Jake of a heartbeat. Jake tried calling the broker who had arranged the load, but the phone number went to a disconnected voicemail. When he called the shipping company listed on the paperwork, directory assistants told him no such business existed. Even more alarming, when Jake tried to look up the delivery address online, he found no record of a town called Millfield anywhere in Montana. Despite every instinct telling him to abandon the load, Jake continued driving. He was an independent contractor with significant expenses, and abandoning freight would result in serious financial and legal consequences. He convinced himself that the strange circumstances had reasonable explanations. Perhaps the cargo contained some kind of preservative chemicals that explained the smell, and the sealed doors were just an extra security measure for valuable medical research. As Jake drove through the night into Montana, the sounds from his trailer became more pronounced. What had started as occasional tapping and scratching evolved into a constant rustling and movement that suggested multiple sources of activity. Sometimes, Jake could hear what sounded like wet sliding noises, as if something gelatinous was moving around inside the trailer. The GPS coordinates led Jake onto increasingly remote roads as he approached the supposed delivery location. The highways gave way to state routes, then county roads, and finally to unmarked dirt tracks that seemed to lead deeper into uninhabited wilderness. His truck's satellite communication system lost signal. His cell phone showed no service, and even his CB radio picked up nothing but static. Around 3 a.m., Jake's headlights illuminated a sign that should have been impossible. "Welcome to Millfield, Montana. Population 847. The town appeared out of the darkness like a movie set, with a main street lined by buildings that looked decades old but were in perfect condition. Street lamps cast circles of yellow light, but Jake saw no people, no other vehicles, and no signs of normal activity. The delivery address led Jake to a large building at the end of the main street. It looked like a cross between a medical facility and a warehouse, with loading docks and what appeared to be laboratory equipment visible through large windows. As Jake backed his trailer up to the designated bay, floodlights activated automatically, bathing the area in harsh white light. 3 figures emerged from the building to supervise the unloading. They wore full-body protective suits similar to what Jake had seen at the pickup location. But their movements were wrong somehow, too fluid and coordinated, like they were performing a choreographed dance rather than walking naturally. When they spoke to each other, Jake could hear their voices through his open window, but the language wasn't English or any other human language he recognized. The unloading process began immediately, with the suited figures using specialized equipment to cut through the hardened sealant on Jake's trailer doors. The moment the doors opened, the smell that had been plaguing Jake throughout his journey intensified to an almost unbearable level. But worse than the odor was what he glimpsed inside his trailer before the figures blocked his view. The cargo wasn't medical supplies or research materials. Jake saw what appeared to be large, translucent containers filled with some kind of biological material suspended in viscous fluid. The containers pulsed with internal light, and the contents moved with a disturbing organic motion that suggested life forms unlike anything Jake had ever seen. Some of the containers had cracked during transport, leaking their contents onto the trailer floor, where the fluid had begun eating through the metal. As the suited figures unloaded the containers, Jake realized with growing horror that some of the biological material was responding to his presence. The contents of several containers pressed against their walls, creating impressions that looked almost like faces. Human faces, twisted in expressions of agony or terror. The fluid around these impressions took on a reddish color that reminded Jake of blood. Jake tried to start his truck and leave, but the engine wouldn't turn over. When he looked at his instrument panel, all the gauges were spinning wildly, and warning lights were flashing in patterns that corresponded to the pulsing rhythm he'd been hearing from his trailer. It was as if his truck had become infected by whatever he'd been hauling, its mechanical systems compromised by exposure to the biological cargo. One of the suited figures approached Jake's cab and gestured for him to roll down his window. When Jake complied, the figure spoke in perfect English, though its voice had an electronic quality that suggested it was being artificially generated. "Thank you for completing this delivery. Your services are no longer required." Jake felt a sharp pain in his neck and looked down to see that the figure had injected him with something using a device that looked more like a medical instrument than a weapon. The injection site immediately began to burn, and Jake could feel whatever had been injected spreading through his bloodstream like liquid fire. As the drug took effect, Jake's vision began to blur, and his thoughts became increasingly disconnected. Through the growing haze, he saw more figures emerging from buildings throughout the town, all wearing the same protective suits. They moved with the same unnatural coordination, suggesting that Millfield wasn't a real town at all, but some kind of facility disguised as a rural community. Jake's last coherent memory was seeing his own reflection in his truck's mirror and realizing that his skin was beginning to show the same dark stains that had appeared on his trailer. The biological material he'd been hauling hadn't just been cargo. It had been spreading throughout his truck and into his own body during the long journey from Oregon. 3 days later, Jake's truck was found abandoned at a rest stop outside Billings, Montana. The trailer was empty and had been thoroughly cleaned with industrial solvents, leaving no trace of whatever cargo it had contained. Jake himself was never found, despite extensive searches by law enforcement and his family. The official investigation concluded that Jake had likely suffered some kind of medical emergency or psychological breakdown, abandoned his truck, and wandered into the wilderness where he died of exposure. But other truckers who knew Jake refused to accept this explanation. He was an experienced driver with no history of mental health issues, and abandoning a valuable truck made no economic sense. More disturbing were the reports from other drivers who claimed to have received similar loads from the same mysterious broker. Several truckers reported picking up medical supplies from unmarked warehouses, hauling sealed trailers to remote locations, and experiencing strange symptoms during transport. Most of these drivers completed their deliveries without incident, but a few simply disappeared, their trucks found empty in remote locations, with no explanation for what happened to either the drivers or their cargo. The town of Millfield, Montana, doesn't appear on any official maps or census records. The GPS coordinates Jake followed lead to an area of uninhabited wilderness with no structures or roads. Yet truckers continue to report receiving deliveries to this non-existent location, and some accept the loads despite the premium rates and unusual circumstances. Jake's truck was eventually sold at auction, but its new owner reported mechanical problems that defied diagnosis. The vehicle's systems would occasionally malfunction in ways that seemed almost organic, and a persistent odor in the cab couldn't be eliminated despite professional cleaning. After several months, the truck was scrapped, its parts scattered to salvage yards across the country. The most chilling aspect of Jake's disappearance is the possibility that he wasn't the victim of whatever was in his trailer, but rather became part of it. The biological materials he transported may have been designed to merge with their host, transforming human tissue into something that serves the purposes of whoever operates the facility, disguised as Millfield, Montana. Somewhere in America's network of independent freight brokers, loads continue to be offered for transport to locations that don't exist, carrying cargo that transforms both the vehicles and drivers who haul it. And in remote areas disguised as small towns, facilities continue their work, processing deliveries that arrive from across the country and converting their contents into forms that can integrate with human biology in ways that science hasn't yet discovered. Kevin Walsh had been driving the same 2018 Peterbilt for 4 years when he replaced the driver's side mirror after a minor accident at a truck stop in Memphis. The replacement mirror came from a salvage yard in Arkansas, pulled from a rig that had been totaled in what the yard owner described as a real strange wreck. Kevin didn't think much about the mirror's history. He just needed a quick, cheap replacement to get back on the road with a load bound for Seattle. The mirror looked identical to his original equipment, with the same mounting hardware and adjustment mechanisms. Kevin installed it himself in the salvage yard's parking lot, adjusted the angle for proper visibility, and was back on Interstate 40 within an hour. The first indication that something was wrong came about 50 miles west of Memphis, when Kevin noticed movement in the new mirror that didn't correspond to anything happening on the road behind him. At first, Kevin attributed the strange reflections to fatigue. He'd been driving for 12 hours straight and was pushing the limits of his legal driving time. But as night fell and traffic thinned out, the images in the mirror became impossible to ignore. Instead of showing the empty highway behind his trailer, the mirror displayed what appeared to be other vehicles, trucks, cars, and motorcycles that weren't actually there when Kevin checked his other mirrors or looked directly behind him. The phantom vehicles in the mirror moved with their own logic, independent of the real traffic around Kevin's truck. Sometimes he would see a convoy of old trucks following closely behind him, their headlights creating a procession that stretched back beyond the mirror's range of vision. Other times, the mirror showed modern vehicles driving erratically, weaving between lanes and traveling at impossible speeds that would have resulted in crashes if they were real. Kevin pulled into a truck stop near Little Rock to inspect the mirror more closely. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the parking lot, the mirror appeared completely normal, just standard glass in a regulation housing. But when Kevin looked into it from his driver's seat, he could see the phantom traffic continuing to move behind him, as if the mirror was showing a different highway entirely, one that existed parallel to the real Interstate 40, but followed different rules. The most disturbing aspect was that some of the vehicles in the mirror appeared to be decades old. Kevin saw trucks with designs from the 1970s and 1980s, perfectly maintained, but clearly from different eras. Some of the cars looked even older, with styling from the 1950s and 1960s, yet they moved alongside modern vehicles in a traffic pattern that defied chronological logic. As Kevin continued west, through Arkansas and into Oklahoma, he began to recognize patterns in the phantom traffic. Certain vehicles appeared repeatedly, always in the same relative positions, as if they were following predetermined routes. One truck in particular, a faded blue Kenworth with distinctive chrome exhaust stacks, appeared in his mirror every time Kevin checked it, maintaining a constant distance behind his trailer, regardless of his own speed or lane changes. The blue Kenworth became Kevin's unwitting obsession. He started timing its appearances and trying to interact with it by changing his driving patterns. When Kevin slowed down, the phantom truck slowed down proportionally. When he accelerated, it matched his speed perfectly. When he changed lanes, the blue truck would shift position to maintain its relative location behind him, even though Kevin's other mirrors showed nothing but empty highway. Around midnight, somewhere in the Oklahoma Panhandle, Kevin decided to test whether the phantom traffic could see him as clearly as he could see them. He flashed his brake lights repeatedly in a pattern: 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, the universal SOS signal that any trucker would recognize. The response from the blue Kenworth was immediate and terrifying. Its headlights flashed back the exact same pattern, followed by a series of rapid blinks that seemed almost frantic. Kevin grabbed his CB radio and tried to make contact. "Breaker 19, this is Highway Ghost eastbound on the 40, mile marker 23. Blue Kenworth behind me. You got your ears on?" The response came not through his radio speakers, but from somewhere inside his own cab, a voice that seemed to emanate from the mirror itself. "Highway Ghost, this is Phantom Rider. Been trying to reach you for 30 years. The voice was distorted and hollow, like it was traveling across an impossible distance. "You got the mirror. You can see us now. We've been waiting for someone who could see." Kevin's hands began shaking on the steering wheel. The voice in his cab continued. "That mirror came from my truck. Wrecked it back in '92, trying to get away from what I was seeing. Didn't work. Once you see the other road, you can't unsee it. We're all here, everyone who's seen it, driving the highway that runs alongside yours." The realization hit Kevin like a physical blow. The phantom vehicles in his mirror weren't random traffic. They were trucks and cars driven by people who had somehow become trapped on an alternative version of America's highway system. A parallel road network that existed in the same space as the real highways, but operated according to different laws of physics and time. "How do I get rid of the mirror?" Kevin asked, speaking directly to his reflection. The response came from multiple voices now, as if every driver on the Phantom Highway was speaking simultaneously. "You can't. Once you're connected, you're part of the network. The only way off is to bring your truck across to our side." Kevin tried covering the mirror with a towel, but he could still sense the phantom traffic behind him. The presence of the other vehicles had become a constant weight in his mind, like having passengers he couldn't see but could always feel watching him. When he uncovered the mirror, the blue Kenworth was closer than before, and he could now make out the driver, a man in his 50s wearing a trucker cap, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion that looked decades old. The phantom driver was gesturing urgently, pointing to something Kevin couldn't see. Other vehicles were gathering behind the blue Kenworth, forming a convoy that stretched back beyond the mirror's range. All the drivers were making the same pointing gesture, directing Kevin's attention to something off to the side of the highway. Kevin looked where they were pointing and saw it, a rest area that wasn't marked on any of his maps or GPS systems. The exit ramp appeared in his headlights like it had materialized from thin air, leading to a facility that looked decades old but was in perfect condition. The phantom vehicles in his mirror were all signaling for the same exit, their turn signals blinking in unison. Despite every rational thought screaming at him to keep driving, Kevin found himself taking the exit. His truck seemed to steer itself down the ramp toward the mysterious rest area, as if the phantom drivers had somehow gained control of his vehicle. The facility ahead looked like something from the 1970s, classic architecture and signage that belonged to an earlier era of highway travel. As Kevin pulled into the rest area, he realized it was occupied by dozens of trucks and cars that matched the vehicles he'd been seeing in his mirror. The phantom traffic had become real, or perhaps Kevin had crossed over into their realm. Drivers were walking between the vehicles, all of them looking tired and confused, as if they'd been traveling for decades without reaching their destinations. The driver of the blue Kenworth approached Kevin's cab. Up close, his exhaustion was even more apparent, deep lines around his eyes, and a weariness that seemed to go beyond mere fatigue. "Welcome to the way station," he said. "This is where we rest between runs on the Shadow Highway. Time moves different here. Some of us have been driving the same routes for 40 years, trying to find our way back to the real world." Kevin learned that the rest area existed in the space between the real highway system and the phantom roads visible in his mirror. Drivers who became trapped in the parallel network would eventually find their way here, a place where they could stop, but never truly rest, always compelled to return to the endless highways that led nowhere. The mirror chooses who can see, the blue Kenworth driver explained. Usually it's drivers who are isolated, pushing too hard, spending too much time alone on the road. Once you see the shadow traffic, you become part of it. Your truck starts appearing in other drivers' mirrors, and eventually, you cross over completely. Kevin spent what felt like hours in the way station, talking to drivers who had been trapped on the phantom highways for decades. They told him stories of endless routes that seemed familiar, but led to destinations that didn't exist, of deliveries that could never be completed, and of a growing compulsion to find new drivers who might be able to see the shadow traffic. When Kevin finally returned to his truck, he found that his mirrors, all of them now, not just the replacement, showed both the real highway and the phantom traffic simultaneously. The two road networks existed in the same space, separated only by a barrier that Kevin could no longer distinguish. He could see normal traffic moving along Interstate 40, but superimposed over it was the endless parade of phantom vehicles following their own mysterious routes. Kevin completed his delivery to Seattle, but the journey took much longer than it should have. He found himself repeatedly taking exits that led to rest areas and truck stops that existed only on the Shadow Highway network. Each stop brought him into contact with more trapped drivers, all of them trying to find their way back to the real world, but unable to escape the parallel roads. The worst part was the growing realization that Kevin was becoming one of them. His logbook showed discrepancies that couldn't be explained, hours of driving time that seemed to occur outside normal temporal flow, miles covered on routes that didn't appear on any official maps. Other drivers began reporting seeing Kevin's truck in impossible locations, driving highways that had been closed for construction or didn't exist anymore. Kevin's final transmission on his CB radio was recorded by another trucker near Spokane. "This is Highway Ghost. If anyone receives this, don't trust replacement mirrors from salvage yards. The Shadow Highway is real, and once you see it, you can't get back. We're all here, driving forever, trying to find our way home." Kevin's truck was found a week later at a rest stop outside Portland, empty, but with the engine still running. The logbook showed he'd been driving continuously for over 200 hours, an impossibility given federal regulations and human endurance limits. The replacement mirror was gone, apparently removed and taken by someone unknown. But drivers continue to report seeing Kevin's red Peterbilt in their mirrors, always maintaining a constant distance behind them on empty stretches of highway. And in salvage yards across the country, mirrors from wrecked trucks wait for new owners who don't understand that some reflections show more than just the road behind you. They show the roads that run parallel to our world, populated by drivers who took a wrong turn somewhere and can never find their way back. Eddie Vasquez bought the used Freightliner Cascadia in Dallas during the summer of 2022, eager to become an owner-operator after 15 years of driving company trucks. The previous owner, a man named Carl Hutchins, had died of a heart attack while parked at a truck stop in New Mexico, and his estate was selling the rig at a price Eddie couldn't refuse. What Eddie didn't know was that Carl hadn't died peacefully in his sleep. He'd been found sitting upright in his driver's seat at 3 a.m., his eyes wide open and his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The truck seemed perfect for Eddie's needs. The 2019 model had low mileage, a well-maintained engine, and a spacious sleeper berth that would serve as his home during long-haul runs. The interior showed normal wear from Carl's use, but everything was clean and functional. The only odd detail Eddie noticed was that the sleeper berth's mattress looked brand new, as if it had been recently replaced. Eddie's first few runs went smoothly, hauling loads across the Southwest without any problems. The truck performed flawlessly, and the sleeper berth was comfortable enough for proper rest during mandatory break periods. But on his fourth trip, deadheading from Phoenix to pick up a load in El Paso, Eddie experienced his first taste of what would become a nightly nightmare. He'd parked at a truck stop outside Tucson around 10 p.m., planning to get 8 hours of sleep before continuing to El Paso. The sleeper berth felt normal when Eddie climbed in, pulled the curtains closed, and settled down for the night. But around 2 a.m., he was awakened by the sensation that someone else was in the berth with him. Eddie felt the mattress shifting, as if another person had climbed into the narrow space. The movement was subtle, but unmistakable. The rhythmic compression and release of springs that indicated someone lying down beside him. When Eddie reached out in the darkness, his hand encountered nothing but empty air, yet the sensation of another presence persisted. At first, Eddie attributed the experience to stress and the adjustment period of sleeping in a new environment. But the phenomenon repeated itself every night, always around 2 a.m., always with the same pattern of movement, suggesting someone climbing into the berth. Eddie tried leaving lights on, setting up his phone to record video, and even sleeping in the driver's seat instead. But nothing changed the nightly visitation. The presence became more pronounced over the following weeks. Eddie began to feel body heat radiating from the empty space beside him. And sometimes he could hear breathing that wasn't his own, slow, labored exhalations that suggested someone struggling with respiratory problems. The breathing had a wet, congested quality that reminded Eddie of his grandfather's final days before succumbing to lung disease. Eddie researched the truck's history and learned more about Carl Hutchins. The previous owner had been a veteran driver with over 30 years of experience, known for his reliability and dedication to the job. But during his final months, other drivers had reported that Carl seemed increasingly paranoid and exhausted, claiming he couldn't sleep properly and was constantly tired, despite spending adequate time in his sleeper berth. The situation escalated when Eddie began experiencing what felt like physical contact from the invisible presence. He would wake to the sensation of a hand touching his shoulder or arm, always gentle but unmistakably real. The touch was cold, unnaturally so, and left behind a lingering chill that would persist for hours after Eddie woke up. Sometimes he could feel breath on his neck, accompanied by whispered words in a voice he didn't recognize. Eddie tried to rationalize these experiences as symptoms of sleep deprivation or stress-induced hallucinations. He visited a doctor, underwent sleep studies, and even consulted with a therapist who specialized in anxiety disorders. All the medical tests came back normal, and the professionals attributed his experiences to the psychological challenges of adjusting to life as an independent trucker. But Eddie knew what he was experiencing wasn't psychological. The presence in his sleeper berth was real, and it was becoming more aggressive with each passing night. The gentle touches evolved into more forceful contact, pushing, pulling, and grabbing that would leave Eddie with bruises he couldn't explain. Sometimes he would wake to find his blankets pulled away or his pillow moved to the foot of the berth. The breakthrough came when Eddie decided to research Carl Hutchins more thoroughly. He contacted other drivers who had known Carl and learned disturbing details about the man's final months. Several truckers reported that Carl had become obsessed with something he called the passenger, an invisible presence that he claimed rode with him in his sleeper berth every night. According to these accounts, Carl had tried everything to get rid of his unwanted passenger. He'd had the truck blessed by multiple religious leaders, installed new bedding and interior components, and even attempted to sell the rig several times. But potential buyers would take test drives and report feeling uncomfortable in the sleeper berth. describing sensations of being watched or touched by something they couldn't see. Eddie discovered that Carl's death hadn't been as straightforward as a simple heart attack. The coroner's report mentioned unusual circumstances. Carl had been found in his driver's seat in the middle of the night, despite having signed into the truck stop's log as planning to sleep in his berth. Security camera footage showed Carl leaving his truck around 2 a.m. and walking toward the main building, but he'd collapsed in the parking lot before reaching the door. The most disturbing detail was that Carl had been talking to someone when he collapsed, carrying on a conversation with an invisible companion. Other drivers in the area reported hearing Carl's voice, pleading with someone to leave him alone and let him sleep. But security footage showed he was completely alone in the parking lot. Armed with this information, Eddie confronted the presence directly. During his next mandatory rest period, he waited in the sleeper berth for the 2 a.m. visitation. When he felt the familiar sensation of someone climbing into the berth beside him, Eddie spoke aloud. "Carl, I know you're here. You need to move on. This isn't your truck anymore." The response was immediate and terrifying. The temperature in the sleeper berth plummeted, and Eddie could see his breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. The presence became more tangible, and Eddie felt what seemed like hands grabbing his arms and shoulders with desperate strength. A voice, barely audible but unmistakably real, whispered in his ear, "Can't sleep, can't rest, keep driving, have to keep driving." Eddie realized that Carl hadn't just died in the truck. His spirit had become trapped in the sleeper berth, doomed to experience eternal insomnia and driving the spectral highways that exist parallel to America's real road network. The presence wasn't malicious, but rather desperate for the rest that death should have provided, but somehow hadn't. The nightly encounters intensified after Eddie's attempt at communication. Carl's spirit seemed to gain strength from being acknowledged, and the physical manifestations became more pronounced. Eddie would wake to find the sleeper berth's curtains moving without any air circulation, items rearranged in patterns that spelled out route numbers and mile markers, and sometimes even CB radio transmissions coming from his truck's radio, despite the unit being turned off. The phantom radio messages were always the same: Carl's voice calling for assistance, reporting his location, and asking for directions to destinations that didn't exist on any map. Other truckers began picking up these transmissions and reporting them to authorities, creating confusion and concern about a driver who seemed to be lost and in distress, but couldn't be located. Eddie's health began deteriorating as the sleepless nights accumulated. He was consuming dangerous amounts of caffeine and stimulants to stay alert during driving periods, and his reflexes were becoming dangerously impaired. He knew he was approaching the same state of exhaustion and desperation that had consumed Carl, but he couldn't afford to abandon the truck that represented his investment in independence. The situation reached a crisis point during a run through West Texas. Eddie hadn't slept properly in over a week, and he was beginning to see and hear things during his driving periods. Phantom vehicles that matched his speed, CB chatter from truckers who had died years earlier, and road signs for destinations that existed only in the memories of long-dead travelers. During a mandatory rest stop outside Amarillo, Eddie made a desperate decision. Instead of fighting Carl's presence, he tried to help the trapped spirit find peace. He researched Carl's final intended destination and discovered that the man had been trying to get home to his daughter's wedding when he died. The wedding had taken place 3 years earlier, but Carl's spirit seemed trapped in the eternal journey toward a destination he would never reach. Eddie drove to the town where Carl's daughter lived and parked his truck outside the house where the wedding reception had been held. In the sleeper berth that night, he spoke to Carl's presence. "You made it. You're here for the wedding. "Your daughter got married, and it was beautiful. You can rest now." The response was a sensation of overwhelming gratitude and relief. The cold presence that had haunted Eddie's nights gradually faded, and for the first time in months, he felt truly alone in his sleeper berth. The temperature returned to normal, the phantom breathing stopped, and the 2 a.m. visitations ended. Eddie completed several more runs without incident, and the truck performed normally. But he couldn't shake the knowledge of what had happened to Carl, and what could happen to any driver who became too attached to the road, too isolated from human connection, and too focused on the endless journey rather than the destinations that give travel meaning. 6 months later, Eddie sold the Freightliner and bought a different truck. The Cascadia was purchased by another owner-operator who reported no unusual experiences during his first few months of ownership. But Eddie sometimes wonders if Carl's spirit simply moved on to other highways, or if it's waiting patiently for another driver who might become so consumed by the road that they forget how to find their way home. The trucking industry has always attracted people who are more comfortable in motion than at rest, more at home on the highways than in stationary locations. But Eddie learned that some drivers become so identified with the journey that they can't accept when it ends, creating a form of haunting that turns the very vehicles that represent freedom into prisons of eternal unrest. In sleeper berths across America, the spirits of drivers who couldn't let go continue their ghostly runs, sharing space with the living and reminding them that some passengers never reach their final destination. Frank Delacroix had eaten at every major truck stop chain from coast to coast during his 19 years of long-haul driving. But the Iron Horse Diner off Interstate 80 in Nebraska served food that defied every rule of time and decay. Frank first discovered the place during a blizzard in January 2023, when whiteout conditions forced him to take the next available exit before visibility dropped to zero completely. The exit ramp led to a truck stop that looked like it had been frozen in time since the 1970s. The main building featured classic diner architecture with large windows, red vinyl booths, and a neon sign that flickered against the swirling snow. What struck Frank immediately was how well maintained everything appeared, despite its obvious age. The paint wasn't faded, the chrome fixtures gleamed, and the parking lot was perfectly plowed, despite the ongoing storm. Frank parked his rig among a dozen other trucks and hurried inside to escape the brutal cold. The diner's interior matched the exterior's retro aesthetic, complete with checkered floor tiles, a long counter with spinning stools, and a jukebox playing country music from decades past. The warm air carried the comforting aromas of coffee, bacon, and freshly baked pie that made Frank's mouth water after hours of driving through the storm. The waitress who approached his booth looked to be in her 50s, wearing a classic pink uniform with a name tag that read Dolores. Her appearance was immaculate, from her perfectly styled hair to her spotless apron, but something about her seemed slightly off in a way Frank couldn't immediately identify. When she smiled, her expression appeared painted on, too consistent and unchanging to be entirely natural. "Welcome to the Iron Horse, honey," Dolores said in a voice that carried a slight echo, as if she was speaking from inside a large, empty room. "What can I get you tonight?" Frank ordered coffee and the meatloaf special, standard truck stop fare that would fill his stomach and warm him up for the remainder of his journey. Dolores wrote down his order with mechanical precision, her handwriting absolutely perfect, in a way that suggested careful practice rather than natural flow. As she walked away, Frank noticed that her footsteps made no sound on the hard tile floor. While waiting for his food, Frank observed the other customers in the diner. Most were truckers like himself, sitting alone in booths or at the counter, quietly eating their meals. But their behavior seemed oddly synchronized. They all lifted their coffee cups at exactly the same intervals, chewed their food with the same rhythm, and turned pages of newspapers with identical timing. The conversations he could overhear were repetitive, with the same phrases being spoken by different people in the same cadences. Frank's coffee arrived in a heavy ceramic mug that was almost too hot to touch. The coffee itself was perfect, exactly the right temperature, ideal strength, and somehow fresher than any truck stop coffee had a right to be. But as Frank drank, he noticed something disturbing about the mug itself. The ceramic showed hairline cracks and stains that suggested decades of use. Yet the coffee's heat seemed to be emanating from the mug rather than the liquid it contained. The meatloaf special arrived with the same unsettling perfection. The portion was generous, the vegetables were crisp, and the mashed potatoes were fluffy and buttery. But the food had an odd quality that Frank struggled to identify. It tasted exactly like meatloaf should taste, but almost too exactly, as if it had been engineered to match some idealized memory of comfort food rather than being actually cooked by human hands. As Frank ate, he began noticing details about the diner that didn't make sense. The clock on the wall showed 11:47 p.m., but the hands never moved, despite the obvious passage of time. The jukebox played the same songs in the same order, with each track beginning exactly as the previous one ended. Most unsettling, the other customers never seemed to finish their meals. Their plates remained at the same level of fullness, no matter how long Frank watched them eat. When Frank asked Dolores for his check, she presented him with a handwritten bill that showed today's date, but yesterday's prices. The amounts were significantly lower than what Frank was accustomed to paying at truck stops, reflecting costs from several decades in the past. When he pointed out the discrepancy, Dolores smiled her unchanging smile and said, "Our prices never change, honey. We serve the same meals at the same cost, every day." Frank paid with cash, but when Dolores returned with his change, the bills she handed him looked wrong. They were the correct denominations, but the paper felt different, older and more substantial than modern currency. The serial numbers were formatted in a style Frank didn't recognize, and the printing had a subtle quality that suggested these bills had been issued years before their printed dates. As Frank prepared to leave, he decided to visit the restroom before returning to his truck. The facilities were as impeccably maintained as the rest of the diner, but the fixtures appeared to be original installations from decades past. The mirror above the sink showed Frank's reflection clearly, but also seemed to display the bathroom as it had looked in previous eras. He caught glimpses of different tile patterns, older fixtures, and even what appeared to be other people using the facilities at different times. Back in the main dining area, Frank noticed that the storm outside had completely stopped, despite weather reports predicting the blizzard would continue through the night. Through the diner's windows, he could see clear skies and stars, as if the severe weather had never existed. His truck was exactly where he'd parked it, but the snow that had been accumulating on his windshield was gone, and the vehicle appeared to have been recently washed. Frank climbed into his cab and checked his logbook, expecting to record a rest break of about an hour. But according to his electronic logging device, no time had passed at all. The system showed he'd arrived at the truck stop and departed in the same minute, despite his clear memory of spending significant time inside the diner. His fuel gauge read exactly the same as when he'd arrived, and his odometer showed no change in mileage. Confused but eager to make up time, Frank continued west on Interstate 80. He tried to process what he'd experienced at the Iron Horse Diner, but the memories seemed oddly fluid, like trying to recall details of a dream that grows less distinct with each passing moment. The only concrete evidence of his stop was the lingering taste of perfect coffee and the handful of oddly textured bills in his wallet. 3 weeks later, running the same route, Frank decided to stop at the Iron Horse again. He took the same exit, but found only an empty lot where the diner had been. No building, no parking area, no sign that any structure had ever existed at that location. Frank drove to a truck stop 10 miles down the highway and asked other drivers about the Iron Horse. None had ever heard of it, and several veteran drivers who regularly ran I-80 insisted no truck stop had ever operated at that exit. Frank researched the location online and discovered disturbing information about the site's history. The exit had indeed been home to a truck stop called the Iron Horse Diner, but it had burned down in 1987 after a kitchen fire that killed 3 employees and injured several customers. The business had never been rebuilt, and the land had remained vacant for over 30 years. The most chilling detail Frank uncovered was a list of the fire victims. One was a waitress named Dolores McCarthy, described in newspaper accounts as a dedicated employee who had worked at the Iron Horse for over 20 years. Her photograph in the archive matched the woman who had served Frank his meal, down to the pink uniform and perfectly styled hair. Frank found online forums where other truckers shared similar experiences. Dozens of drivers reported stopping at truck stops, diners, and rest areas that seemed to exist in temporal bubbles, serving food and providing services from previous decades. The experiences were always the same: perfect service, impossibly good food, prices from the past, and the gradual realization that none of it should have been possible. Most disturbing were the reports from drivers who had eaten at these temporal establishments multiple times. They described a growing compulsion to return, despite knowing the places shouldn't exist. Some reported that the food from these phantom diners never fully satisfied their hunger, creating a craving that could only be filled by returning to the same impossible locations. Frank began avoiding that stretch of Interstate 80, but he found himself thinking about the Iron Horse Diner constantly. The memory of that perfect coffee and meatloaf haunted him, creating a longing that regular truck stop food couldn't satisfy. He started taking longer routes that would justify stopping at the exit, but each time, he found only the empty lot. 6 months after his initial encounter, Frank finally saw the Iron Horse again. It appeared exactly as before: the same 1970s architecture, the same flickering neon sign, the same welcoming warmth spilling from the windows into the night. This time, Frank noticed other details he'd missed during his first visit. The trucks in the parking lot all appeared to be models from previous decades, perfectly maintained, but clearly from different eras of trucking history. Frank entered the diner and was greeted by Dolores with the same unchanging smile. "Welcome back, honey," she said, as if no time had passed since his previous visit. "Your usual table is ready." Frank realized with growing horror that he had a usual table, despite having eaten there only once before. Dolores led him to a specific booth that felt familiar in a way that defied logic. The menu she handed him was identical to the one from his first visit, complete with the same yellowed pages and faded photographs of food that looked too perfect to be real. As Frank sat in the Iron Horse Diner, surrounded by customers who never aged and staff who never changed, he understood that he was becoming part of the establishment's temporal loop. Each visit would draw him deeper into the diner's pocket of frozen time, until eventually he would become one of the synchronized customers who ate the same meals in the same rhythm, forever trapped in a moment that refused to move forward. The Iron Horse Diner continues to appear to drivers who are hungry for more than just food, those who long for the simplicity and comfort of an earlier era, when truck stops were gathering places for a community of drivers who looked out for each other. But some comfort food comes with a price that isn't listed on any menu. and some meals are so perfect that they can never truly be finished, creating a hunger that can only be satisfied by returning to places that exist outside the normal flow of time. Bobby Hartwell rebuilt the Caterpillar C-15 engine himself in his garage outside Memphis, using parts salvaged from 3 different trucks that had been totaled in separate accidents across the interstate system. As a certified diesel mechanic turned owner-operator, Bobby took pride in breathing new life into damaged equipment, but the engine he assembled from those salvaged components would prove to remember more than just mechanical specifications from its previous incarnations. The rebuild process had taken Bobby 6 months of meticulous work. The engine block came from a Peterbilt that had jackknifed during an ice storm in Montana, killing the driver instantly. The transmission was salvaged from a Kenworth that had rear-ended a concrete barrier in Texas after the driver fell asleep at the wheel. The ECM and wiring harness came from a Freightliner that had been found abandoned on a Nevada highway, its driver never located, despite extensive searches. Bobby installed the rebuilt engine in his 2015 Volvo and was impressed by its performance during initial test runs. The power delivery was smooth, fuel efficiency exceeded expectations, and the engine ran with the quiet confidence of a perfectly balanced machine. But during Bobby's first long-haul run with the rebuilt power plant, he began experiencing phenomena that defied mechanical explanation. The first anomaly occurred somewhere outside Little Rock, Arkansas, during a routine night run to Dallas. Bobby was maintaining a steady 65 miles per hour when the engine suddenly began running rough, as if it was struggling with a heavy load going uphill. But the highway was flat, Bobby's trailer was nearly empty, and all gauges showed normal readings. The rough running lasted exactly 3 minutes before the engine returned to its smooth operation. Bobby pulled into the next truck stop and performed a complete diagnostic check. Every system tested normal, and he found no mechanical reason for the temporary power loss. But as he reviewed his electronic logs, Bobby discovered something disturbing. The GPS coordinates where the rough running had occurred matched the exact location where the Montana Peterbilt had jackknifed 2 years earlier. The 3-minute duration corresponded precisely to the time the original driver had spent struggling to regain control before the fatal crash. Over the following weeks, the engine began exhibiting similar episodes at specific locations across Bobby's regular routes. Near Amarillo, Texas, the engine would suddenly idle high and the transmission would downshift aggressively, as if the truck was fighting against phantom braking. The location matched where the Kenworth had crashed into the concrete barrier. In Nevada, along a desolate stretch of highway, the engine would cut power completely for exactly 47 seconds, the amount of time investigators estimated the abandoned Freightliner had sat running before its driver vanished. Bobby researched the histories of the 3 source vehicles more thoroughly and uncovered disturbing patterns. All 3 trucks had been involved in unexplained incidents beyond their final accidents. Drivers who had operated these rigs before their crashes reported mechanical behaviors that didn't match any known failure modes. Engines that seemed to respond to invisible inputs. Transmissions that shifted according to road conditions that didn't exist. And electrical systems that activated controls no human hand had touched. The Montana Peterbilt's driver, a veteran named Russell Kane, had called his dispatcher just hours before the fatal jackknife, reporting that his truck was driving itself and remembering roads it had never traveled. The Texas Kenworth's driver, Maria Santos, had logged multiple complaints about her engine fighting against her, accelerating and decelerating without input from the throttle pedal. The Nevada Freightliner's missing driver, James Park, had posted on truckers' forums about his engine-making decisions that seemed to come from somewhere else. As Bobby continued running loads with the rebuilt engine, he began to understand that the mechanical components retained more than just their original specifications. They carried the memories and driving patterns of every mile they had traveled with their previous operators. The engine didn't just burn fuel and create power. It replayed the experiences of drivers who were no longer alive to control their trucks. The psychological impact intensified when Bobby realized the engine was learning from him as well. During familiar routes, the engine would anticipate his driving decisions, downshifting before hills he hadn't yet crested, adjusting idle speed before rest stops he hadn't yet decided to take. The truck was developing a collective driving consciousness that combined Bobby's habits with the phantom patterns of its deceased previous operators. The situation became dangerous when the engine began overriding Bobby's control inputs. During a run through Colorado, Bobby attempted to slow down for construction, but found his throttle pedal unresponsive. The engine maintained highway speed through the work zone, as if following the memories of drivers who had traveled that route before construction had begun. Bobby had to use his emergency brake to avoid rear-ending vehicles ahead of him. More terrifying were the instances when the engine seemed to be driven by the experiences of drivers who had died traumatically. During thunderstorms, the engine would exhibit the erratic behavior Russell Kane had described before his fatal jackknife, fighting against steering inputs and creating the same dangerous instability that had led to the Montana crash. In heavy traffic, the engine would recreate Maria Santos's final moments, surging forward uncontrollably as if trying to complete the rear-end collision that had killed her. Bobby tried reprogramming the ECM and replacing electronic components, but the phantom driving behaviors persisted. The engine's memory seemed to be stored at a deeper level than its computer systems, embedded in the metal itself through some process that transcended normal mechanical function. Every piston stroke carried the echo of previous combustions. Every gear engagement repeated the shifting patterns of drivers who no longer existed. The breaking point came during a night run through Nevada, along the same highway where James Park had vanished. Bobby felt the familiar sensation of the engine beginning to override his control, but this time was different. Instead of replicating mechanical failures, the engine began driving according to inputs from someone who wasn't in the cab. The steering wheel turned under Bobby's hands, following a route that deviated from the marked highway onto unmarked desert roads. Bobby fought against the steering, but the engine's power steering system was working against him, following GPS coordinates that weren't programmed into any navigation system. The truck drove deeper into the Nevada desert, following what seemed to be the final route James Park had taken before his disappearance. Bobby could hear voices over his CB radio, not current transmissions, but recordings of Park's final communications, describing confusion about his location and inability to control his vehicle. The engine finally stopped in a remote area where Bobby found the scattered remains of the original Freightliner. The truck had been stripped by scavengers over the 2 years since Park's disappearance, but enough wreckage remained to confirm this was where the missing driver had ended his journey. Bobby's rebuilt engine had used its collective memory to navigate back to the site where one of its component systems had last functioned. Among the wreckage, Bobby found James Park's logbook, its pages bleached by exposure, but still readable. The final entries described the same phenomena Bobby had been experiencing, an engine that drove according to the memories of previous operators, gradually overriding the current driver's control until it could complete the journeys that had been interrupted by death. Park had realized too late that his truck was no longer under his command, but was being driven by the accumulated experiences of every driver who had operated its components. Bobby used his satellite phone to call for rescue and abandoned his truck in the desert. He walked several miles to reach a highway where passing motorists could pick him up, leaving behind the Volvo and its rebuilt engine. When authorities returned to recover the vehicle, they found it had been moved from where Bobby had left it, positioned alongside the wreckage of the original Freightliner, as if the two trucks had been reunited. The rebuilt engine was never recovered. Local authorities assumed it had been stolen by parts scavengers, but Bobby knew better. The engine had completed its purpose, returning to the location where its collective memory had originated. Somewhere in the Nevada desert, the Caterpillar C-15 continues running, powered by fuel sources unknown, following routes that exist only in the memories of drivers who can no longer control their own destinies. Bobby returned to driving company trucks, refusing to work on any more rebuilt engines or salvaged components. He learned that some mechanical parts retain more than just their physical specifications. They carry the experiences, habits, and final moments of everyone who had operated them. In salvage yards across America, engines, transmissions, and electronic systems wait to be rebuilt into new configurations, but they bring with them the accumulated memories of every mile they've traveled and every driver who has trusted them with their lives. The trucking industry's practice of rebuilding and reusing major components ensures that the mechanical consciousness of deceased drivers continues to influence vehicles long after their operators have died. Bobby's experience revealed that trucks aren't just machines, but repositories of driving experience that can transcend the death of their human operators, creating vehicles that drive according to the collective memories of everyone who has ever turned their keys and trusted the road ahead.